How many branches does philosophy have? I was recently asked to participate in a discussion where this was brought up as an issue. I want to establish that that is the context because even though I will briefly describe the three-branch view, the main thrust of the video is going to be to raise issues with the view. But it's important to realize that the issues that I raise are not me attacking the three-branch view. It's simply making viewers aware of some of the subtleties. In other words, it's almost like using the idea of three branches of philosophy as a jumping off point to introduce more philosophy. So think of it as an opportunity to broaden your philosophical horizons rather than as any kind of nitpicking exercise with respect to the three branch view. That's not the intention of this. So with that in mind, let's proceed. So very often philosophy is introduced to new students with a threefold division. And it goes something like this: that philosophy's main divisions are metaphysics, epistemology, and then something that is periodically referred to as axiology. And this is very pervasive. It's a very common way to introduce the discipline of philosophy. A quick Google search can probably satisfy you on that point. Then again, if you are coming to this video, it is possible that you've already taken a philosophy class where it was introduced to you that way. I have both of the two volumes on the screen. Those volumes introduce it in much this way, that there's this threefold division, very common, very useful. So just to sketch briefly what it is, I'm sure you're aware of it, but metaphysics is sometimes also called ontology, and the idea is concerned with questions about existence. What is it to exist? What is it to be? What sorts of things exist? Sometimes there's a distinction between metaphysics and ontology, something like this, where metaphysics deals with the questions of what is it to exist, and ontology is a sort of catalog of the things that exist. You can find that in the literature, but often they're just used interchangeably. That's not the subject of this video, so we'll pass over that point. Metaphysics also gets into specialty questions. For example, what is the nature of time? Causation. These kinds of things are very typical of what you might encounter in a metaphysics course, metaphysics book, and so on. Epistemology, on the other hand, asks questions that have to do with knowledge claims. Usually, do we know anything? And if so, how do we know? What differentiates knowledge from mere true belief? And so on. And finally, axiology, and I know, for example, that Honer and Hunt use this word. It basically just is value theory, and it's sometimes a stand-in for both ethics and aesthetics. So sometimes you'll find the three major divisions of philosophy being metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Basically, it's the same point, except in this case, ethics would be subsumed under a larger category of axiology, which would also include aesthetics. And in this designation, it would be, what is it for an action to be good or bad? What is it for a work of art to be beautiful or not? How should we act? Those are the kinds of things that are discussed, for example, in practical ethics and so on. But philosophers are inveterate question askers, that's for sure. So inevitably, they can be counted on to challenge this threefold framework. And that, again, is the thrust of this video. I want to sketch just a few reasons why this threefold division might be thought to be a bit problematic. In doing that, I'm going to sketch 4 quick reasons why a person might question the three-branch view of philosophy. So the first reason is that the three branches may not themselves be mutually exclusive. And this is even if the three branches are accepted as is. In other words, even if somebody says, yeah, there are three branches, metaphysics, epistemology, axiology. Nevertheless, there's still a problem because it might be hard to draw sharp distinctions between the branches. So I'm going to give an example of that. So just a moment ago, we said basically metaphysics or ontology concerns itself with existence questions, and epistemology concerns itself with knowledge questions. All right, but what about questions like, is there such a thing as knowledge? Is there such a thing as truth? Does justification exist? Is it a property? And so on. What I just did was asked questions like, does knowledge exist? Well, that's a question about existence, right? That's supposed to be the province of metaphysics, but we're talking about knowledge. So is it epistemology or is it metaphysics? And I mean, honestly, it's not clear. You can encounter questions of that kind in both camps. You could encounter it in a metaphysics textbook, and you could encounter it, probably more likely to encounter it in an epistemology textbook. But the whole point here is accepting the three categories. It's sometimes not clear how to draw hard and fast distinctions between them. And in fact, it seems like hard and fast distinctions between even these three categories may not exist. Now, similarly, metaphysics concerns itself with what exists. Axiology, well, that's value theory. Okay, but subdisciplines like metaethics have come up to deal with other kinds of crossover questions. So, for example, part of what metaethics is concerned with is examining the ground for moral judgments. And by ground for moral judgments, we mean, is there something that exists in reality that makes moral judgments true if they're true and false if they're false? Are there moral properties, for example, or are moral judgments merely emotional outbursts? So just to sort of gesture toward how this can be fleshed out, the philosopher G.E. Moore had an idea what he called non-natural properties. And in his opinion, say goodness just existed. There was a property of goodness. This was independent of God. It was independent, though, also of natural properties. So it's not a matter of what it is for humans to flourish. It's not a fact about sociology or history or psychology. It's simply a non-natural property. It's irreducible to anything else in the natural world. And so he called it a non-natural property. On the other hand, there is a naturalist camp, and this would include people such as logical positivists like A.J. Ayer, Rudolf Carnap, and the like, that just deny that ethical statements have truth values. So one way to do this was the way Ayer did it. Ayer called his view emotivism. Basically what he meant was that all moral statements, such as murder is wrong, really just translates into boo murder. I hate murder. Boo. It was just a moral exclamation in Ayer's view. Carnap, on the other hand, favored a view called imperativism. Of course, that comes from the grammatical idea of an imperative, meaning a command. So Carnap, on the other hand, thought that moral claims were commands. But if I say clean up your room as a command, it's not true or false. It's simply non-truth evaluable. And therefore, these particular possibilities on naturalism try to deflate the idea that moral values have any truth values at all. Of course, naturalists could go a completely different way. I don't have that represented on here, and this isn't a video about possibilities within metaethics, but another way to go for naturalists would be to reduce moral claims to, say, psychological claims. And it's often stated kind of in an Aristotelian way that, well, what's good is what is conducive to human flourishing. That's metaethics, but it's dealing with the foundations or lack thereof for ethical claims. So is that axiology or is it metaphysics? And again, it's not entirely clear. When I introduced that first reason, I said that the three branches may not be mutually exclusive, even if they are accepted as is. So it's important here to interject that not everyone does accept them as is. For example, the logical positivists rejected metaphysics completely. The logical positivists, you may recall, basically stand in a line of British empiricists that can go all the way back to Bacon and Locke and so on, and it includes people such as Moritz Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, Otto Neurath, and A.J. Ayer from England. One of their main claims was completely rejecting metaphysics. Metaphysics is simply illicit, meaningless, and so on. Now here's an interesting point, and this is that the primary reason, or at least one primary reason why the logical positivists attacked the idea of metaphysics was based on arguments from philosophy of language. So in the discussion about how many branches philosophy has, this idea of philosophy of language got brought up. It's interesting to note that the logical positivists would not have said, oh yeah, philosophy of language, that's a branch of epistemology. No, they would have basically rejected metaphysics. And you could even say that a logical positivist might say, if they were to say, I don't know if they do or they don't, that there are three views of philosophy, and here they are, it's philosophy of language, epistemology, and axiology. Or since we just saw that they often threw out values as truth valuable, they might even say, look, philosophy only has two branches, philosophy of language and epistemology. And things get a bit more complicated from there. Now, on the other side, the three branches may not be exhaustive. At least that's what somebody might be worried about. So the second reason to doubt that the three-branch view is adequate is that maybe we need more branches. Now, one reason to think that that might be correct is that there are innumerable subdisciplines in philosophy, and three of these were listed in the discussion that I'm commenting on already: logic, philosophy of language, and philosophy of science. Now, as an aside, there is another discipline called philosophy of logic, and that is not the same thing as logic itself. So again, my ambition here is simply to show how complicated things can get and to introduce a bit more philosophy using the three branches as a jumping off point. Philosophy of logic might concern itself with questions such as, are logical rules of inference objective? And this would bear, for example, on versions of epistemological relativism. Another question that might arise is, what is the status of so-called first principles? Do they exist? So notice that the idea of are rules of inference objective seems to be an epistemological question in a way. But it could also be argued to be a metaphysical question. And certainly the question of do first principles exist is structured as a metaphysical question. Of course, the first principles are things like the principle of identity, A is A, the principle of non-contradiction, that A is not non-A, the principle of the excluded middle, that you either have A or non-A, but not both, and so on. But all these principles and more have been challenged in the last 100 years especially. And this, along with the development of things like non-Euclidean geometries and the flowering of the field of so-called artificial intelligence, have given rise to alternative logics. So you might have heard of fuzzy logic, three-value logic, and so on. And the key feature of these alternative logics is that they allow for the assignment of truth values beyond true or false. So normally, and this is the law of the excluded middle, something's either true or false. That's it. That's a basic first principle of traditional logic. But there are alternative logics now. So one question in philosophy of logic is, what do we make of all of these? And it's possible that these various geometries and logics might incline a person to a philosophical pluralism about geometry and logic. And by pluralism, of course, I mean kind of a philosophical equivalent of let a thousand flowers bloom, that you have a posture of tolerance toward a wide assortment of alternatives. We just let them all in. They're all equally, quote, valid versions of logic. There's no preference that should be given to traditional logic. They're all equally good. But this is a distinct area of inquiry, and to quote the philosopher Timothy Williamson, he also brings up the idea that logic is often appealed to as a neutral arbiter between metaphysical theories. So sometimes people want to appeal to logic as a way of deciding between questions. And the thought is that logic makes no substantive claims on its own. It just simply deals with the relationship between ideas. But again, that is a question that would be addressed in philosophy of logic. It probably will not be brought up in logic itself. So we have here an example of how the branches of philosophy seem to ramify. They get more and more all the time. But besides logic, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, philosophy of logic, there are also innumerable others. And some of the main ones would be things like philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion, and so on. And here's another interesting fact, and that is philosophy of science itself just splits apart into the various different sciences. So each one has a philosophy of its own. So for example, there's a philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics. So the question arises then, what should one do with all these, quote, other disciplines? I mean, how do we think of philosophy of mind? How do we think of philosophy of biology? Are these different branches? So off the top of my head, there are several different ways that a person could go in treating all these different branches. And the first way would echo what we've already stated, and that is pluralism. You adopt pluralism and just say every subdiscipline is a branch. There aren't just three. We've got metaphysics, epistemology, logic, axiology, philosophy of biology, philosophy of logic, and we just count every one that you can think of as a separate branch. That's a possible way. Another way you might refer to as minimalism or maybe purism, and that would be, nope, there's only the big three. So now the project is to try to explain how all the other ones somehow can be subsumed under the main three. Or as somebody mentioned, came up in the discussion, maybe you can say something like that philosophy of mind is scattered across the big three. So philosophy of mind cuts across, has some metaphysical questions, some epistemological. We can probably say the same thing for philosophy of language, for philosophy of science in general, and so on. Another way would be to modify our view of the branches, but not in a pluralist way where we just let everything in, and not in a way where we attempt to say, well, no matter what, we're always going to stick with the big three. This other way would be to say, yeah, maybe we can sort of switch out some. So for example, the logical positivists I hinted earlier might have done this had we brought this issue up to one of them. Maybe they would have said, yeah, metaphysics, that definitely goes, axiology, that definitely goes, and what are you left with? You're left with philosophy of language, maybe epistemology. So now we have a view where there's only two branches. Or maybe somebody says, no, I like the big three, metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, but I don't think logic can fit in there. So let's add a fourth one. That'd be a variation of this view. Maybe we add philosophy of language on it as well. So you can see, again, the kind of approaches that might be given here. And of course, I mean, I kind of added this fourth. I said I was going to give three possible approaches to other disciplines, but a fourth one occurred to me, and that is to just repudiate the whole thing, reject all the branches. So in other words, rather than saying philosophy has innumerable branches, or saying it has 3 or 2 or 4, we just say it has 0. We're not interested. And before you think, well, who does that? And obviously, if somebody is pursuing philosophy as a discipline, they're unlikely to take that point of view because presumably they have reasons to think philosophy is worthwhile. So you would expect this kind of repudiation view, or this kind of low-grade, localized nihilism, if you like, to apply to people who just don't think very much of philosophy. That brings up this third point that I want to make, and that is there is disagreement over what counts as philosophy. Now, this is a huge issue, and I certainly don't have time to get into it here. I'll touch on it a bit in my concluding comments. Let's again take up this idea of repudiation very briefly, and we'll say there are some people who profess that philosophy is just simply worthless. It's a time-wasting exercise. It's just empty navel gazing, as they used to say about some of these Eastern yogis who kind of contemplate their own navels, so to speak, meaning that it's armchair speculation. It's just weaving stories out of their minds like spiders in a kind of Baconian criticism. And this view very commonly issues from people that you might call proponents of scientism. If you're not familiar with that word, I think Ferris Bueller says this, or Matthew Broderick in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He says something like, be careful of isms. Well, anytime you add ism onto something, it kind of makes it an all-encompassing principle. So science is one thing, but scientism is the view that there is no other legitimate way of knowing other than science. And just a few people who have been taken to take a dim view of philosophy. Here we see Stephen Hawking from The Guardian in the United Kingdom. He thinks, or thought, science had overtaken philosophy, meaning you don't need to do philosophy anymore. It's passé. You can kind of marshal some quotes from Bill Nye to give you the same kind of an impression. Neil deGrasse Tyson, likewise, according to these articles, which are summarizing an interview that he gave, he finds philosophy distracting. It's not necessary. It's, again, empty navel contemplation, empty armchair speculation. If you want to know about the world, get out of a philosophy classroom and pick up a microscope or a telescope, or go work in a particle collider, or you know what I mean. It's do science. That's their perspective. Now, this comes out of a larger perspective, which we can identify as naturalism. Having said that, there are naturalists who allow for philosophy. Now, one way that this can be done is where they might think that philosophy doesn't have any distinctive areas of inquiry, but it does have a particular set of methods. Now, I'm going to sketch a little bit more about this in the conclusion. For now, let's just think, what does that mean to have a particular set of methods? And here I'm going to direct your attention to the origins of analytic philosophy. So you may or may not know, but analytic philosophy is a branch of Western philosophy that basically comes up around 1900. And some of the main players, a little bit before that too, but some of the main players are going to be Gottlob Frege. Then you get into people like Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore. They list a number of these in this little book summary here, but somebody that's not listed would be A.N. Whitehead. And then from them, you get into a big name, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And the key point about analytic philosophy is that it's got a dual focus. Its two pivot points, essentially, if you like, are language and logic. So here's where philosophy of language really takes a prominent role, and logic takes a prominent role. And it's almost as if what some of these people would say is that philosophy really just boils down to methods. And in that case, it has two branches, language and logic, and that's it. That's a possible view that somebody might have. What you should realize by way of context is that Frege, for example, was reacting against German idealism. So to the German idealists, logic was simply the way that our minds worked. In other words, it was a function of psychology. Logic didn't have principles that regulated our thinking any more than the rules of our circulatory system and heart dictate how blood circulates in our body. It was just our brains work a certain way, call that psychology or neuroscience or whatever you want to call it, but that's the reality. And this perspective taken along a psychological route is what some of the German idealists were saying in the 19th century. Frege thought that view was just simply not right. Bertrand Russell, Whitehead, and Moore were thinking along similar lines in England. They were unaware of what Frege had done until Bertrand Russell encountered an Italian named Giuseppe Peano, who was a big name in mathematics and was also working on some proto-philosophy of language. And he clued Russell in to Frege, and at that point, Russell was able to introduce Frege to the English-speaking world, and it basically created this analytic philosophy. Now, one thing about logic here is that logic has always existed. You had it in different forms. So it started off Aristotelian logic, the medievals developed it, but in the sense that it has come to be known, it's very mathematical. And in fact, Russell and Whitehead were, at least initially, keenly centered around the question of how do logic and mathematics relate to one another. Is logic based on math? Is math based on logic? And this is still kind of an ongoing question. What is the difference, and which, if either, has priority between logic and mathematics? So call that whole thing kind of mathematical logic. And it's different from the syllogistic logic of Aristotle, and it has developed along a number of different paths, which again is not the main focus of this video. The main focus is simply to say that to the analytic philosophical school, this metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology, maybe even we throw the whole thing out and just say, no, it's really just philosophy of language and logic. Finally, there is non-naturalism, and this would be those few thinkers who still think that philosophy is a respectable discipline in and of itself, and that it has its own distinctive subject matters, possibly plural, subject matter or subject matters plural. It may also have methods, so it's not that the non-naturalist is committed to, denigrating philosophy of language or logic. It's not that. It's simply that in addition to that, the non-naturalist is more inclined to say that philosophy has its own sort of purview. So an example of a naturalist in the analytic tradition would be somebody like W.V.O. Quine, and an example of a non-naturalist would be somebody like Moore, whom we mentioned earlier. And again, these were 4 reasons that the 3-branch view could be questioned. The 4th reason would be because there's disagreement over what counts as science. So remember, we just looked at how there's disagreement over what counts as philosophy, but there's also disagreement about what counts as science. So if we're talking about philosophy of science, how does that fit into the 3 branches? It's not just the definition of philosophy that complicates the question. It's also the fact that there's no one agreed upon definition of what counts as science. And we can extend this point to any other discipline you like. So if we want to extend it to philosophy of language, we would simply say there's disagreement over what counts as language. And here you can just think Chomsky and his innatist view of language versus somebody who has an acquisitional view of language. And I don't want to get into any of these specific issues. I'm simply trying to allude to them, touch on them, in order to illustrate the complexity. Just to give you a sense, the word science itself, of course, comes from the Latin scientia, and all it meant was knowledge. So if you look at the history of thought, you can go back to the ancient world, to the medieval. We can call those both together pre-modern. Then the modern period maybe starts with the Renaissance. We include the Enlightenment, maybe the Romantic period. We get into, industrialization and so on. Now we're more in a postmodern environment. But if we look at the history, we can go all the way back to, say, Aristotle, at least according to the volume of Aristotle's works, the collection of Aristotle's works that was owed to Andronicus of Rhodes. Remember, 2 of the volumes there, one of them had the title Physics and the other Metaphysics. And all that meant was that it was the volume after the physics. But the point is, physics dealt with questions like what is in the observable world. Metaphysics dealt with these sort of abstruse issues about substance, causation, and so on. But this language persisted. I mean, even into the Enlightenment period, they still referred to what we would think of as science as natural philosophy. Even today, a person who gets a high degree in astronomy, for example, might have a PhD in astronomy. And of course, that means doctor of philosophy. They're a doctor of philosophy about astronomy. So this is a holdover from an earlier period. And at that stage, all of it would have been philosophy. Or all of it would have been philosophy of science, or all of it would have been science. They wouldn't have distinguished them because all science meant, again, scientia, was knowledge. You were pursuing knowledge whether you were looking at the observable world or whether you were looking at issues of causation. It was all just science, philosophy. It was one and the same. You really don't get separate sciences taking up shop until, it starts very slowly, alchemy turns into chemistry. You get this mathematicized physics, in the 16th, 17th century, but then 18th century, you start to see other sciences coming up, maybe geology. But by the 19th century, here's where things really just ramify. Psychology, sociology, and the like of those, that wouldn't have come about until approximately the 19th century, at least not in any form that we would recognize today. And just to sort of add to the complexity, just go back to Aristotle's 4 causes. And the investigation, whether it was physics or metaphysics, would have been grouped around what Aristotle referred to as his 4 causes. Scientists in Aristotle's time, seekers of knowledge, would have looked at material cause, formal, efficient cause, final cause. Well, some of that has been completely chucked aside. Modern science, in a way, only considers material cause and efficient cause. Formal cause, that would have been things like essences, substances, or universals. That's been thrown out. Final causes has also been thrown out. Usually it's theologians talking about final cause. So when theology got marginalized, talk of final causes usually got marginalized as well. It was resurrected maybe in the 20th century by people like Teilhard de Chardin in Catholic context, and again, Terence McKenna. But consider the perspective of Quine. His perspective was called naturalized whatever, so naturalized metaphysics. And what did that mean? Read the quote here. It says, Quine takes seriously the idea that it is within science itself and not in some prior philosophy that reality is to be identified and described. Our best scientific theory of the world tells us as much as we can know about reality. In other words, it's all science. This is kind of like what feeds into the Bill Nye and the Tyson perspective. Philosophy just doesn't have its own distinctive area of inquiry. Similarly, Quine had a naturalized epistemology, which was likewise the idea that you just simply took epistemology and you put it under a branch of natural science. In this case, it would be psychology. So to Quine, epistemology isn't a discipline in philosophy. It is a subset of psychology. So in other words, philosophy is a branch of natural science on Quine's view. So if you want to ask about branches of philosophy, maybe that's fine, but to Quine, he wants to make the point that there isn't a separate discipline of philosophy, really. It's simply an adjunct to natural science. There is no metaphysics, and there's only chemistry and physics. There's no epistemology. There's only psychology, or maybe sociology, and so on. So to wrap it up, the three-branch view is perfectly respectable. Philosophy is taught that way. I was taught that way. I teach it that way. It's a very useful way to introduce people to philosophy. Having said that, it's definitely open to challenges. Now, I gave 4 reasons why a person might challenge it. One would be, again, just to summarize, that the branches are not mutually exclusive. They're not sharply divided from one another. Or number 2, that it's not exhaustive. There are innumerable subdisciplines, and it's not clear what to do with them. Thinkers disagree about what counts as philosophy. That was number 3. And number 4, that they disagree about what counts as science or language or religion or mind or whatever it is. They disagree, and therefore some of these divisions are open to question. But I want to leave you with 4 major distinctions that I think can help you maybe to think through these issues in an ongoing way. The first is a big one. I didn't really touch on it here at all, but it's the difference between Western and Eastern philosophy. So notice that this 3-branch view pertains to Western philosophy. Eastern philosophy, Hinduism, Buddhism, and the like of that would be completely different. They would divide philosophy differently. But secondly, even within Western philosophy, we have 2 sort of major subdivisions. That would be analytic philosophy and continental. Now, analytic we sketched just a bit earlier. Continental I didn't get into at all. We can talk about that maybe in a separate video, but that is something to keep in mind. Finally, one that I did spend some time on was the difference between philosophical naturalism and non-naturalism. So the naturalist, his tendency is to subsume everything under science versus the non-naturalist that wants to say, no, philosophy has room to explore things that go beyond science. But finally, the distinction that I haven't used so far, but that I personally think is the most helpful to use when thinking about the branches, is the distinction between a first order and a second order discipline. So there would be a distinction between first order philosophy and second order philosophy. So to explain that, a first order discipline, let's say, is a field that looks directly at some subject matter. Now, this is just a rough and ready definition. I mean, it would need to be made a lot sharper in order to really put philosophical weight on it, but I'm hoping you get a fix on this if I give you a couple examples. So for example, astronomy deals with outer space. What does biology deal with? Living organisms. What does geology as a science deal with? Well, rocks, the earth, right? What does zoology deal with? Animals. Okay, so we see there can be some overlap here, but biology and zoology, they're sciences because they have a specific subject. Zoologists, animals. That's what they study. Now, a second order discipline is a field that studies other first order disciplines. So for example, on this view, non-naturalists would hold that the big 3, metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology, are philosophy's first order disciplines. What does philosophy study that no other field studies? Well, metaphysics. That's one answer. And non-naturalists tend to give that answer, is that Metaphysics is a first order discipline. So when we say philosophy has three branches, what we really mean to say on non-naturalism would be that philosophy has three first order disciplines: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. In that way of thinking, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, and so on would be second order philosophical disciplines. Whereas metaphysics is a first order discipline where philosophy studies being, or in epistemology, philosophy studies knowing. If philosophy of language is to be counted, we would say, well, that's a second order discipline. It's where philosophy is concerned with language. Language has its own first order concerns. Language would be concerned with the words we say, the words we write, the sounds we make coming out of our mouths. But philosophy of language would then be a second order discipline. Or, for example, consider biology. Again, what's its first order concern? Living systems. What is philosophy of biology concerned with? It's concerned with the discipline of biology itself. So it's a second order discipline. Now there is a difference though between the way a naturalist would see that and the way that I just sketched from a non-naturalist perspective. Naturalists would probably be more inclined to see all of philosophy as a bundle of second order disciplines on natural science. So the naturalist would say, yeah, you're close, close, but all those first order disciplines, astronomy, biology, geology, zoology, and so on, those are the first order disciplines. Whereas philosophy, it's simply language and logic. It's these methods that are applied to the natural sciences. So all philosophy is basically a second order discipline on natural science. All philosophy, that isn't simply pie in the sky naval contemplation where we're just simply making things up. Remember, that was the logical positivist line. So there's a very sharp distinction between non-naturalists and naturalists. So look again at the four distinctions: Western versus Eastern, analytic versus continental. One of the big ones is naturalism versus non-naturalism. I think that's probably the biggest one because it's going to determine your bigger perspectives here. So in summary, I think a person's answer to the question, how many branches are there, is at least partially a product of their pre-commitments to some of these larger issues. I myself, I am a non-naturalist, and I find the first order, second order distinction to be extremely illuminating. I would personally flesh it out by saying what I just said, that philosophy really has three or four, maybe you let logic in as the fourth one, but philosophy has three first order disciplines: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. And finally, it has innumerable second order disciplines: philosophy of biology, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion. All of these would be second order disciplines.